My brother-in-law walked me down the aisle. Not my father, not my mother. My husband's older brother, who had known me for 3 years, offered me his arm in the church parking lot because the 2 seats we'd reserved in the front row, the ones with the little white ribbon and the handwritten name cards, were empty. They stayed empty through the entire ceremony, through the vows, through the first dance, through the moment my husband cried when he saw me walk through those doors. My parents were 4 hours away in Kelowna, attending my sister's housewarming party. I want to be clear about something before I keep going. I'm not telling this story so you'll feel sorry for me. I'm telling it because 3 months after my wedding, I found out that my grandmother had left me something my parents had been managing on my behalf for over a decade, and what happened next changed my entire life. But first, you need to understand who I was before any of this. I grew up in a mid-sized city in Ontario, the older of 2 daughters. My sister is 4 years younger than me, and from the time she was born, something shifted in our household that I never fully had words for until I was much older. It wasn't that my parents were cruel. They weren't. They paid the bills, kept the heat on, made sure we had winter coats and lunches. But there was a current running underneath everything. A quiet, consistent preference that shaped almost every decision they made for the next 2 decades. My sister's name is Amber. She was, by every family account, the gifted one, the social one, the one who made my mother laugh, who charmed every teacher, who was picked first for things and praised loudly. I was quieter, more serious. I liked reading and took things literally and spent a lot of time in my room. I wasn't difficult. I just wasn't Amber. When I was 17 and starting to think about university, my parents sat me down and explained very gently that they weren't in a position to help financially. My father had recently changed jobs. There were expenses. The timing wasn't right. I accepted this. I applied for student loans, won a small scholarship through my high school, and enrolled in an accounting program at a university 3 hours from home. I worked part-time every semester. I deferred 1 year to save more money. I graduated with a degree and about $42,000 in debt, which felt enormous and also just like the cost of the life I was building. When Amber turned 17, my parents refinished the basement into a dedicated study space for her. They hired a tutor for her chemistry. When she was accepted to university 2 years after me, they drove her there with a carload of new furniture and paid her first year's tuition in full. By the time I found this out through a comment my aunt made at Christmas that year, casually, as if I obviously knew I had already been out of school for 8 months and was making minimum payments on my loans. I remember sitting in the bathroom at my parents' house that Christmas, looking at myself in the mirror and telling myself it didn't matter. They must have had more money by then. Things changed. It wasn't worth making a scene. I made that speech to myself a lot over the years. I moved to Vancouver at 24, got a job at a mid-size accounting firm, rented a 1-bedroom with a roommate, kept my head down. My parents called occasionally. They came to visit once in 3 years briefly, on their way to a long weekend in Victoria. I visited them more often, especially after my grandmother's health started declining. My grandmother was my mother's mother. She lived alone in the house she and my grandfather had owned for 40 years in a small town outside of London, Ontario. She was sharp and funny, and made the best butter tarts I've ever eaten, and she loved me in a way that was uncomplicated and direct. She used to hold my face in both hands and say, "You are going to be just fine." I believed her when she said it. She passed away when I was 28. I flew home for the funeral. My parents handled her estate. My mother was the executor. I was told that my grandmother had left a modest amount, and that most of it was going toward covering her end-of-life expenses and some small gifts to a few family members. I was given a piece of her jewelry, a thin gold ring she'd worn on her right hand, and told that was my portion. I thanked them and flew back to Vancouver. I met my husband 6 months after that. He's from Calgary, works in renewable energy project management, and he is the steadiest, most decent person I have ever known. We dated for 2 years and got engaged on a Thursday night in our apartment with no fanfare at all, which is exactly how both of us wanted it. We planned our wedding for the following June. Small ceremony, about 60 people, in a heritage venue just outside of Vancouver. We drove out to look at the space together on a Saturday afternoon in February, and I remember standing in the aisle thinking that I genuinely could not wait. I called my parents that same evening. I told them the date, the location, the rough timeline. My father said he'd put it in the calendar. My mother asked whether there would be a vegetarian option at the dinner. Over the following months, I sent them updates the way you would send updates to people who matter. I asked my mother if she wanted to come to Vancouver to help me look at dresses. She said she'd think about it. I followed up twice. It never happened. I bought my dress on a Saturday with my two closest friends and a bottle of champagne we drank in the changing room. I booked 2 seats for my parents at the front table. I had their names written on small cards in calligraphy by a woman who did it as a side business. I ordered them a small floral arrangement as a table gift. I thought about whether my father might want to walk me down the aisle and decided to ask. He said he wasn't sure, he'd let me know. He never let me know. 2 weeks before the wedding, my sister texted me to say she'd bought a new house. She and her husband had been renting in Kelowna and had finally found something they loved. A 4-bedroom with a yard, mountain views, the whole thing. Congratulations, I texted back. That's amazing, and I meant it. The housewarming was scheduled for the weekend before our wedding. My parents called me on the Monday after to tell me they weren't going to make it to the ceremony. My mother did most of the talking. She said the drive from Kelowna to Vancouver was nearly 4 hours, and after everything over the weekend they were exhausted. My father had a bad knee. They'd been on the road a lot lately. The ferry option was expensive. Maybe they could come out the following month and we could do a dinner to celebrate. I was sitting at my desk at work when this call came in. I put the phone down after we hung up, and I stared at my computer screen for a very long time. My husband held me while I cried that night and said all the right things. He said we didn't need them there. He said the day was still ours. He said his family would show up, and they did. His parents, his brother, his aunts and cousins filled that front section and cheered louder than anyone when I walked through those doors. His brother offered his arm in the parking lot without making it a big moment. He just said, "Ready?" And I said, "Yes." My parents did not send a card until 11 days after the wedding. We didn't speak much after that. I returned their calls less promptly. When they asked how I was doing, I said fine. I had nothing else to offer. 3 months after the wedding, I received an email from a lawyer's office in London, Ontario. The subject line was straightforward. Estate of my grandmother follow-up, regarding beneficiary documentation. I almost didn't open it. The email was from a paralegal, who explained that the lawyer had been retained by my grandmother's estate for what she described as an outstanding matter regarding the original will. She asked if I could call their office at my convenience. I called the next morning. What the lawyer told me over the next 40 minutes rearranged everything I thought I understood about the last decade of my life. My grandmother had updated her will 2 years before she died. In that updated will, she had left her house a fully paid-off property that had since been assessed at just under $400,000 to be split equally between her 2 grandchildren, half to me, half to Amber. My mother, as executor, had sold the house 8 months after my grandmother died. She had deposited the proceeds into an account she controlled. None of that money had ever come to me. The lawyer had been retained by a cousin of my mother's, someone I'd met maybe twice at family events, who had been a witness to my grandmother's will and had grown uneasy over time about what he'd heard. He hadn't done anything immediately. He said he wasn't sure it was his place. But after a few years, he said, the guilt got to him. He reached out to the lawyer. The lawyer reached out to me. I sat on my kitchen floor after that call. Not because I was devastated, though I was. Not because I was angry, though I was that too. I sat on the floor because I was doing the math in my head, and the math was landing somewhere around $190,000. That was my share. The share that had existed, legally and clearly, in my grandmother's will. The share my mother had redirected, without ever telling me it existed. My husband came home that evening and found me at the kitchen table with a glass of water and a notepad where I'd been writing things down. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment and then said, "What do you want to do?" I told him I wanted to do this correctly. The following weeks were the most organized I have ever been in my life. I contacted a lawyer in Vancouver who specialized in estate disputes. I gathered every document I could: my grandmother's death certificate, the original will obtained through the lawyer in London, property records showing the sale of the house, public land registry documents that were accessible online. I requested my grandmother's estate file through the proper legal channels. What emerged was straightforward. The will was valid. The sale had happened. The proceeds had gone into an account my mother controlled. A portion of those proceeds had since been used. My lawyer identified transfers that aligned with the timing of Amber's tuition payments, the renovation of Amber's first apartment, and a down payment contribution my parents made toward the house in Kelowna. Not the full amount, but enough to make the pattern visible. My lawyer wrote a formal letter. She did not call I do what it was in the letter. She used precise legal language about the executor's obligation to beneficiaries, about the requirement to account for estate proceeds, about the documentation that would be sought through the courts if the matter could not be resolved directly. My parents called me 4 days after receiving that letter. My father spoke first this time. He said there had been a misunderstanding. He said my grandmother's wishes had been interpreted differently, that the intent was always to provide for the family as a whole, that the money had gone to things that benefited everyone. I did not argue with him. I had nothing to argue. My lawyer had already told me that my position was clear. My mother got on the call and cried. She said she was sorry. She said she had done what she thought was right. She said she hoped this wouldn't destroy the family. I told her I hoped so too. What followed was several months of legal process that I will spare you the details of, because the details are tedious and repetitive. My parents did not fight it. I think they knew they couldn't. And I think somewhere under everything my mother did know it had been wrong. My portion of the estate was calculated with interest from the date the sale had occurred. The total came to just over $200,000. The transfer was processed on a Tuesday afternoon. I was at work. I got a notification on my phone, and I stepped outside into the October air, and I stood on the sidewalk and breathed. Here is what I did with it. I paid off the full balance of my student loans, every dollar of the $42,000 I had been carrying for years. I made that payment first, the same day, before I did anything else. It felt like putting something down that I had been holding for so long I'd forgotten what it felt like not to hold it. My husband and I used a portion as the down payment on our first home. A townhouse in a neighborhood we'd always loved but assumed was beyond reach for at least another 5 years. We got the keys in January. I cried in every room. I put a portion into a registered account for our future. I set aside a smaller amount in a fund I set up at my grandmother's name through a local community foundation, a bursary for first-generation university students in the region where I grew up. I named it after her. It's not enormous, but it's something. Every year, it'll help someone who's doing it on their own. And there is one more thing. When my parents had come to collect some of my grandmother's personal belongings in the months after she died, my mother had taken back the ring. She said it had sentimental value, that she'd given it to me too quickly, that she wanted to hold on to it. I'd let her take it. At the time I didn't have the language or the energy to say no. As part of the legal resolution, the personal property distribution from my grandmother's estate was also reviewed. The ring had been catalogued in the original estate inventory. It was my grandmother's. It had been left to me. My lawyer included it in the settlement. My mother sent it back in a small padded envelope. No note. I wear it on my right hand now, the same way my grandmother did. When I look at it, I don't think about my parents or the wedding or the empty seats or any of it. I think about a woman who held my face in both hands and told me I was going to be just fine. She was right. I want to say one more thing before I wrap this up, because I've been thinking about it a lot lately. There are people watching this who are probably in the middle of their own version of this story, still in the part where you're sending the monthly e-transfers and attending the family dinners, and telling yourself it doesn't matter. It's not worth a fight. Maybe things will change. I was that person for a long time. I'm not going to tell you what to do. That's not my place. But I will tell you that the thing I regret most isn't the confrontation, or the legal process, or the months of distance and silence that followed. The thing I regret most is all those years I spent shrinking myself to make room for a version of the family that was never going to see me clearly anyway. My husband's father walked me down the aisle. He held my arm and whispered, "You look beautiful," right before the doors opened. I didn't need the seats filled. I just needed to finally stop pretending they were going to be. "I'm Claire. And I'm doing just fine."